Okay, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Philip Dames. Philip actually got his undergraduate degree here back in 2010 and master's. And Paul and I had the pleasure of co-advising him at that time. We did some really cool stuff in vibratory manipulation. He then went off to get his PhD at University of Pennsylvania. And now he stayed in Philadelphia and is now an associate professor of mechanical engineering, the director of the Temple Robotics and AI Lab at Temple, obviously. He's the winner of the NSF Career Award. And today he's going to tell us about developing and deploying situational awareness in autonomous robotic systems. So please join me in welcoming Philip.
It's great to be back here and see all the fun ways the campus has changed. So I guess before we start unpacking what that means, I just wanted to, do a little bit of, going down memory lane. Right, I got my start in robotics here at Northwestern. So kind of the way I got into the lab originally was I was taking a material science class and I was characterizing the damping and stiffness properties of these flexural joints in the P-pod. Right, I made that figure that's up on the website, and then I kind of graduated from that into building this 2D rolling manipulation Airtable type thing. And then I also was part of the undergrad design competition and did that, I think, 3 of my 4 years here. So that was fun time kind of getting my hands wet in robotics and kind of got me hooked, and here I am. So right. So anyways, kind of coming back to the talk though, I guess the main thing here is kind of situational awareness. And so I just want to go over what I think that means to me, just so we kind of understand what that is and go build from there. So to me, that means robots have to be able to kind of perceive what's in their surroundings, understand what that means, and predict what is, understand what's going on now and what might be happening in the future so that they're able to react and do things accordingly. Right, so one example of that would be like an autonomous vehicle where you're, going around trying to detect all these many different things in your surroundings. There's some uncertainty about what each of the things might be. Most of the time you're pretty sure, but there's still some uncertainty. And so there's kind of three questions that I'm going to kind of address in 3 different parts of the talks. First is, how can an individual robot better understand its surroundings? Second one is, how can robots in a fleet share information with each other? Right, so if one robot learns something about this space and another robot passes through later, how can they exchange that information? And then the last is, how can robots use that understanding that they get from this kind of sensing and mapping side of things to be able to navigate the world more easily, and in particular, move through these complex dynamic spaces. Right, so like I said, my talk is kind of broken into 3 parts that focus on each of these 3 questions. So for the first question, how can individual robots better understand their surroundings? Started out doing a lot of work on multi-target tracking or multi-object tracking. So I'll kind of give a brief overview of that and some of the work we've been doing. Right, so the objective here, right, is we want to figure out, how many objects are in the space around the robot, what is the state of each object, which can include, kinematic data like position, velocity, but can also include data about what is this thing, kind of, semantic meaning of objects. So, right, it's related to SLAM, right, but it focuses a lot more on dynamic objects, right? We're not mapping static landmarks, we're trying to, track things in this quickly moving space. Right, and so there's a lot of sources of uncertainty here, right? Your sensors are unreliable, there's trying to predict what might happen in these complex spaces where there's lots of interaction based on, social rules and things like that. Now, and then there can also be some uncertainty in the self state of the robot, just in terms of, where it is and all of that. Right, so we need tools that can account for all these sources of uncertainty to help the robots build up a good picture. And one of the big problems in multi-object tracking is data association. Right, so if I make a bunch of detections and I have a bunch of objects that I think are there, I need to be able to associate a measurement to an object. This is one of the kind of more challenging problems in tracking and SLAM. Unless you make some assumptions and approximations, it's a combinatorial problem, which really doesn't scale well to big spaces with lots of things. Right, so in this little toy example, right, if I have a little triangular robot with 4 objects in the world, there's a few things that can happen. Let's say this robot can only measure bearing, right, only measure angle to objects. Right, there's a few different things that can happen. Right, in the best case, right, you get an object, a measurement to an object, and you get a pretty accurate estimate of what direction that object's in. Right, that's kind of best case scenario. So there's a little bit of measurement uncertainty. You're not straight on to the angle, but you're pretty good. Right, other things that can happen is you can get a false positive. Right, you think you see something that's not there. Right, and you're using a computer vision algorithm or all these other things. You've seen plenty of false positives before. We need to be able to handle those. There's also this kind of ambiguous association problem, right? There's 2 measurements and 2 objects, but which measurement was from which object? Right, if you just, in this case, right, we don't know. And then last but not least, there's the false negative case, right? If there's something that is there, but you don't see it, right, that's a problem. Right, and so we need tools that can handle all these different cases of things existing or not, and seeing them or not, and also correctly associating, measurements to objects. Right, so there's a lot of work in multi-target tracking coming from the signal processing community. It kind of started in like radar-based tracking for air, monitoring airspaces. But that really assumes stationary sensors, right? I have a radar tower that is not going to move. And a single type of object that I'm looking for, and I have essentially an infinite field of view in this space. And none of those are true for a mobile robot. Right? So, if we're dealing with, say, a camera on a robot, right, we have all sorts of different objects. There's occlusions. We have a limited field of view. Our sensor is on a mobile platform. We need to, update how things work to account for all of the things that come with putting a sensor on a robot. And also, include information about like different types of objects, like, these category labels, dog, bicycle, truck, etc. Right, so the tool that we're using for this is something called the PhD filter, or probability hypothesis density filter. It's a good acronym. I did a lot of work with the PhD filter during my PhD, so it was good. And the main idea here is it's solving both the data association problem and the tracking problem at the same time. Right, so once you have an association, you can use something like a Kalman filter or something like that to update the state. Right, but rather than having it be this sequential task, the PhD filter does both at the same time. Right, and so again, I'm not going to get too far into the math here, just trying to give you a picture of what's going on. So you've done work in state estimation, right? You know that there's kind of the general Bayes filter, and then you make some assumptions and you get a Kalman filter or a particle filter or something. Here, this is essentially a multi-object version of a Bayes filter. Right, and so what the PhD filter does is it tracks the first order statistical moment, in other words, the mean of the distribution over possible sets of targets rather than individual target states. And again, like the thing that's most important for us right here, right, is the PhD takes the form of a density function over the space of targets. Right, so a little toy example, if I have a one-dimensional world with 2 objects in it, the PhD might look something like this. Okay, so here, right, what this tells me, right, is I have one target that's somewhere in here and another target that's somewhere over here. Right, so this density function tells me that there are 2 targets, tells me about where they're located, and tells me that I have more certainty in the location of the right target than the left target because the distribution is narrower. Right, so this density function kind of encodes information about how much stuff there is, where the stuff is located, and kind of certainty in its location. Right.
That's just a continuous function that you've shown there. Is there something combinatorial to it? Is that two different ones that have been added together, or?
It's, I guess here you don't, with the PhD filter, you kind of lose individual target identities. You kind of lump everything together into one density function. So that is one trade-off compared to, say, like the, associate then track. Here you're kind of merging everything together, which makes some things easier, but you lose this identity. Yeah, so like, you can represent this as a, mixture of Gaussians or something like that to cover your space of targets. And then the PhD filter essentially gives you the mechanics for updating the parameters of that representation based on measurement updates. So in, say, the toy example, right, let's say the targets move, the density field would move and spread out a little bit. When the robot measures where the targets are, let's say I measure the left one, but I get a false negative here, so I don't see it. What would happen in the measurement update is something like this, where now I have more certainty in the left target's location and less certainty in the right target's location. Right, so essentially the PhD filter gives us the mechanics for like tracking the evolution of this density function. That again, it kind of encodes target count, target location, and certainty. Right, so if you're interested in the math, read the papers, but this is the bird's eye view of how it works. Right, and so what we did here was we kind of took that, continuous space of just location and added an extra state to the to the target state, which is this class label. So essentially now what we have is a bunch of parallel density functions, one for each type of object. Right, and then we had to kind of look at, how do we handle uncertainty in the detected category when we're doing this state update process, or this measurement update process. So the kind of toy example we used in our hardware tests here is we took 4 brands of water bottles that all look kind of similar. So that's, identifying which one is Deer Park versus Aquafina isn't necessarily all that easy, particularly from distance, because they all are, clear bottles with blue and white lettering on them. Right, so, we put these water bottles around the building, had undergrads take a few hundred pictures and label all of that. And what we found was this kind of, trained a classifier to detect them. And this is the results we got. So, Aquafina was the most distinct. 99% of the time you get, if it's really Aquafina, you detect Aquafina. And I think the main reason for that is just like the shape of the bottle, like the label is a little bit lower on the bottle and it has a blue cap. So it's a little more distinct visually than any of the other categories. But with Nestle, there we only had a 70% success rate of detecting the true thing. So 30% of the time you detected something else. Right, so it's, pretty accurate, but still non-negligible error rates. Yeah.
Were the pictures taken at different angles? So like maybe the title of the brand didn't show up in some pictures?
Yeah. Yeah, so we've kind of put put a bunch of bottles around the lab space, took a bunch of pictures, and then we had a couple thousand images that they needed to, draw bounding boxes and label them all, which was, I'm glad I didn't have to do it. Right, so we kind of, did this work to train our classifier, and then we put that into this, PhD filter framework, and here's the results from a little experiment. So we set it up where we had essentially a square of bottles. We had each brand on one side of the square, but the robot starting out did not know how many bottles there were, where bottles might be located. All it knew is there are 4 brands of water bottle that I want to find. And so this PhD up here is going to be this density function, right? So you'll see different colors corresponding to the different brands, and then the spikes tell you the estimated location of all these things. Right, so when the robot's pretty close to the bottle, you see, we're getting pretty stable detections, but for the bottles that are further away, you'll see the class flickering more, right? So we have more error when we have bottles that are far away. Again, just because you have fewer pixels per bottle. It's the main reason. Right, particularly here, right, see kind of Aquafina, Kirkland, things are appearing, disappearing, false negatives, all sorts of things like that. Right, but in the end, right, our PHP filter estimate gets us the right thing, right? We have, kind of one brand along this edge, another blue, the blue labeled brand along this edge, the red along this edge, the white along that edge. So we're kind of getting the right estimate in the end once we've seen all these models.
And the PhD is stable if you're not looking at it anymore. There's like no normalization or other weird stuff that would cause it to decay.
Yeah, well, I guess under the assumption of stationary targets, once you don't see it, you just assume nothing changes. So in a dynamic scene, there would be this kind of decay and things would just disappear after a sublime. But water bottles aren't going to move anywhere, so we could leverage that.
So this is a distribution over a continuous space of configurations crossed 4 times or something, because you've got.
Yeah, well, yeah, I guess
What's
you
the
have.
what's the space over which, it's a single distribution over this joint space,
So in
or
this case-
4 distributions over?
Yeah, well, in this case, it's the space is R2 cross a 4 element discrete space.
And so it's a single distribution over that space.
Yeah. Yeah,
So like the Aquafina is the white spikes. You said it earlier, like it was most confident of Aquafina, but in this graph, it looks like they're not as tall as the other spikes. They're reason for that.
I think here it's just because, the video didn't go until the robot reached the end of the line, so it just didn't see them quite as many times. Yeah, all good questions. Right, so, this is just kind of, one of the tools we've been using to, do a lot of this multi-object detection. And, I like the representation because it's fairly simple, easy to understand representation, even if all the, updating math isn't necessarily straightforward. Right, so we kind of, we're the first ones to add this semantic class label to a multi-object tracking algorithm. We got, we compared the results here with just kind of the naive, assume the labeled class is correct, and we get more reliable class detections. And then we also have kind of data-driven procedures to learn the different sensor models you need for detection probability, measurement noise, false positive rate, and this class confusion matrix. Right, so not only do we have this, we have if you were going to do it yourself, you can follow these. Here's what we did essentially, so you can try to follow that. And right now we're kind of looking at building on all the recent advances in computer vision, on neural steam reconstruction and semantic segmentation to try to just look at different data representations, different detection algorithms to just kind of make this all work more reliably. Right, so that was the first question. Right, our second question is, now that each robot can kind of perceive what's around it, how do robots share that information across a team? Right, so in say a first responder scenario, right, you're going to have all sorts of different objects. You have a space you want to find them in. You want a fleet of robots to go and get that information. Right, and so here we're going to use potentially a large team with tens to 100 robots. Robots can communicate locally, and we have again this unknown and potentially time varying number of objects in the space that we want to find. Right, so there's a lot of work in these areas. I would say the 2 main families are this area-centric approach that focuses on covering space. These are things like persistent monitoring, kind of Voronoi-based coverage control for surveillance, things like that. Or there's a target-centric approach, which focuses on following a target once you've identified it. Right, and so we're kind of doing, what we're trying to do here is take a little bit of both of these families. Right, and I'll kind of explain what I mean by that. Right, so the main thing we're building on is this Voronoi-based control approach. Right, so if I have a search space and each of these green dots is a robot, what we do here is we build a Voronoi diagram where we partition the space into these cells. where everywhere in this cell is closer to this robot than it is to any other robot. Right, so this is, you know, a nice, easy thing to do. It's a distributed, you can build it in a distributed way, because all you need to know is just where are the other robots nearby me, and that creates these partition boundaries. And then to use this for control, what you can do is essentially find the centroid of each cell, right? Find that, drive to it, the robots get there, you know, repartition the space, rinse and repeat. Right, so you kind of get this, you know, nice, easy way of doing control. And again, once you have the boundaries, calculating the centroid is a local thing. You only need information about your own cell. All right, so what we're going to do, and what it does is it, you know, kind of locally, you know, minimizes this coverage function. All right, so what we're going to do is tie that Voronoi-based control to the target estimates. Right, so when you're calculating a centroid, right, you can calculate a weighted centroid, and here we're using this PhD function, this target density, as our weighting function. So the idea there is, you know, essentially areas with targets are more important, and therefore robots will be driven toward those areas through this coverage approach. Right, so it kind of couples estimation and control, because you essentially, if I think there might be something in this area, robots are going to be incentivized to move to that area. And, you know, whether it's, I know there's something there, or I think there might be something there. And it's also, again, a distributed control algorithm. And then what we need to do is, you know, how can I distribute the PhD filter algorithm across a team of robots to build a, you know, a collective density function to use here. Right, so what we're going to do is essentially use the Voronoi diagram to help partition the PhD up. All right, so in other words, you know, if I have the Voronoi diagram, you know, say robot 3 is in charge of keeping track of the PhD in this part of the environment. Robot 1 is in charge of keeping track of the PhD in this part of the environment. And then all we need to do is, you know, pass information along. Right, so this dotted line is robot 1's old Voronoi cell, and here's its new Voronoi cell. Right, this area used to be robot 1's and is now robot 3's, and so it just needs to send, you know, robot 1 needs to send robot 3 information about here and exchange ownership. So as long as we kind of, you know, do all of that in kind of the right way, right, we can make sure we don't lose information as these cell boundaries shift. And if we're, you know, our PhD is represented as a, you know, a bunch of, you know, Gaussians essentially, right? It's not a whole lot of bandwidth that you need to send, right? It's just like, you know, these are the Gaussian bumps in our density field. These are yours now, they're not mine anymore. Right, and then also, you know, as targets move, you also need to account for that, right? So targets started in robot 1 cell and go into some other robot cell. Robot 1 needs to tell the other robots about that. And then same with the kind of the sensing piece, right? If robot 1 sees into robot 6 cell, and it's 6's cell, and it sees something there, you know, it needs to tell robot 6 that it saw something in its cell, and vice versa. Right, so again, as long as we kind of, you know, keep track of all these different ways that robots can interact, you know, we're not going to lose information at the team level. Yeah.
Is this is it somehow combinatorial? Like the density function? Are you adding components of it together from each of these cells?
Yeah, so I guess no individual robot has the whole thing. It's just kind of essentially like distributed storage of information where we spatially situate that storage. So like, you know, robot 1 stores the density function in this part of the environment. Robot 5 stores the density function in this part of the environment. So if we took what all the robots know and put it together, we have the full picture. But each robot to do control only needs to know about its own cell. Right, so again, like you want the details of how we do all this message passing and things like that, you know, we have the paper, but that's the basic idea is we just kind of split this density function up into different regions and then exchange that information to make sure we don't lose it. Yeah,
And the system would be resilient, like if one of the robots suddenly went offline, fell out of the sky, the others would automatically grow their areas to account for that.
yeah, I guess that is kind of one, you know, we haven't looked at the resilience side of things too much. You know, it's been one of these things that like I've been asked about enough times that I should really jump into it, but yeah, so I guess kind of the way it's done here though, right? If robot 5 disappears, right, essentially the team would lose all the information that robot 5 has, and like if they know robot 5 disappears, then they can then go and learn what was there, but the team would have lost it when the robot kind of died. But you know, we could add some extra, you know, you know, maybe I store what's in my cell and what's in the neighbor's cell so that there's some redundancy. So we've looked at that a little bit, but yeah, just I guess hasn't been a focus. Yeah.
Suppose there's an object between cell 1 and 3 and an ambiguous association. And so 1 and 3 are trying to figure out, you know, whose object is it?
Mhm.
What happens? Do you go to cells 2 and 4 and try to disambiguate otherwise, or?
Mhm.
What is it?
Yeah, I mean, if there's something right on the boundary, you might end up with like, you know, kind of two, you know, two partial peaks that come to a whole, right? So you might have, you know, both robots might know a little bit about it. Right, but if, you know, if the robots are kind of near each other, and can both see it, then they'll kind of, you know, again, they'll both exchange measurements about what they saw in that kind of common area. So, yeah, I mean, there is always like, what do you do on the boundary? But essentially what happens is, you know, either one robot or the other takes ownership, or they both have part of it.
So if I'm a user and I want to query my system, do I send a query to one of the robots or do I broadcast to all of them? And then how does it get routed? Does it get routed? They say, oh, that's not for me, I'll send it to the next guy over there.
Yeah, I guess we haven't looked too much at like the humans robot, you know, the human team interaction piece of it. It's more of, you know, kind of a autonomous robot closed loop system. But yeah, I mean, I guess you could imagine having, you know, each of the robots, you know, send their information back to some central hub to be able to display what's going on at the team level for a user to look at. And whether that would be, you know, multi-hop communication structure or, you know, all-to-one type approach could work, but, you know, I guess it kind of depends on the situation. Yep. Right, so, you know, here's our simulation here, right? So here, these orange diamonds are the target locations. The green dots will be surrounded by circles. The circles are like what each robot can see. The dashed lines are our Voronoi partitions, and these red X's are the goal locations they're driving towards. And so here, the targets are going to be moving, and the robots know essentially the targets could enter and leave the space by crossing this environment boundary. Right, and then on the right-hand side, we have the estimated number of targets in black versus true in red, and then this is just a measure of tracking error, so lower is better. Right, so this is kind of what we end up seeing as our emergent behavior. Right, is, you know, most of the robots will cluster around the edges where they know things might appear at some point, and the robots that are in the middle are following the things that they see. Right, so you can kind of see the goal locations essentially tracking the estimated robot or estimated target locations, right? And that's again, like, you know, we have a higher estimated number of targets in that area. We have this peak in the density function, so the robots are just driven towards that area. And then we also have, you know, lower, kind of a lower peak kind of all around the boundary, because there could be new targets that appear in that space. So that's why the rest of the robots are clustering there. And then when they see a target, they'll kind of, you know, peel off and follow it. Yeah.
So now each robot has a picture of its own local situation. But you still don't have global situational awareness because it's not, they're not actually communicating this. So then what's the next step here?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess they, yeah, again, like they have kind of, like you're saying, they have information about their own cell and they can exchange stuff with each other, like their neighbors. Yeah, I would think, in a practical setting, you would want to have some sort of, probably centralized information, particularly if you wanted to like, have an interface where you're tasking certain robots to do certain things. Yeah, again, that's not a question we've like looked at too heavily yet, but no, it's a good question. Yeah,
Yeah, I just want to clarify something. So if all of these agents were sending their information to a central node, you found the solution. Is that, and then you look at that solution in one of these four other regions, would that match with this local solution?
Yeah.
Okay.
yeah, so that was kind of part of the like rules we put in place for doing the distribution is just making sure we get the same solution, whether it's centralized or this distributed approach. Yeah. Right, so, right, we did this with a whole bunch of different, here we looked at a bunch of different numbers of robots, numbers of targets and sensing radii. Right, and this is the kind of what we get as our kind of tracking error as a function of time. Right, so in general, we see this kind of exponential decay of tracking error. Right, but the, where that asymptotes to and how quickly it asymptotes depends on things like, how many targets are there, how many robots are there, all that kind of stuff. Right, so one question we were looking at is like, can we, we see this kind of common pattern, right? But, can we, where we have this, kind of family of trend lines, right? So can we try to figure out like, how are these parameters in this, family of functions dependent on the environment or, team and task parameters? Right, so like, basically, if I know how many robots there are and I know how many targets there are, right, can I predict how well the team is going to do? Right, and so what we tried to do at first, right, is just say like, can I, right, what I can do is for each of these runs, I can fit an exponential function, I'll get some parameters. And then what I'm gonna look at is like, how do these parameters relate to team or task parameters, like number of robots or number of targets? So this is the picture we got. Right, so A here, right, is this A up front. Right, and so, if I look at A as a function of the number of targets, right, it's pretty noisy, right? It's, there's a lot of blue dots kind of all up and down. There's not kind of a clear trend in the data. Right, like we see in general that if there's more targets, it's a harder task, right? But there's not a clear uniform trend. Right, so what we're trying to do here is, then we ask ourselves, what else could we do? And one thing we looked at was trying to use dimensionless variables. Right, so if in say, fluids, right, you have things like Reynolds number, or in gait analysis, you have the fruit number. Right, and these try to capture some sort of essential behavior in a system that, try to kind of non-dimensionalize things to capture a trend. Right, so we're saying like, can we figure out a dimensionless variable to describe our multi-robot tracking system? Right, so what we had to do here, right, was we had to identify what system parameters we want. Right, so here we picked number of robots, number of targets, sensing radius, and then these measures of density of robots and density of targets. Right, so just, number of robots per unit area in the environment. Right, so we just picked these. Next, what we have to do is write this dimension matrix, where we look at, basically what are the units. So, right, density of targets, right, we have a quantity, and then we have per meter squared. Sensing radius has units of meters. Number of robots has units of quantity. Right, and then a dimensionless variable, thinking of the linear algebra, a dimensionless variable, the units of that have to be 0. And so basically it has it has to be in like kind of the null space of this matrix. Right, so we want to find kind of a generic element in the null space of this matrix. Right here, I have a 2x5 matrix, so my null space will have 3 basis vectors. And essentially what those look like are, these are kind of our 3-dimensionless quantities that we can look at. Right, we have a ratio of targets to robots. Right, so units of quantity divided by units of quantity will be dimensionless. We have another one that is the kind of the sensed area divided by the search area. And we have another one that's kind of the sensed area per robot versus the area per target. Right, so these are the kind of the 3 elements of this basis, of these basis vectors. Right, and so now what we want to do is see, like, can we learn, right, so this is like basically kind of a generic dimensionless variable based on these quantities. And now what we want to do is figure out, like, how important each of these basis vectors is in our space. Right, and so what we want to do here, right, is essentially try to tie this dimensionless variable to these coefficients in our parameter model. Right, and the way we do that is we write each parameter as a polynomial of this dimensionless variable pi. And then we solve an optimization problem that optimizes beta and gamma, where here beta, basically we learn the structure of pi, right, these exponents, and the beta are these polynomial coefficients. So we're learning the structure of this dimensionless variable, and then the relationship between that dimensionless variable and our parametric model. Right, and when we do that, this is the trend that we get out. So now we see these very clear relationships. It's still a little fuzzy, right? But now if I plot A as a function of this dimensionless variable pi, I get a nice, pretty clear picture. So we're able to say, like, now there's a relationship between some measure of team and task parameters and these parameters that describe team performance. Right, so again, there's a lot of different categories of parameters here, right? But what we're trying to do, right, is relate something about the team and task parameters to these performance measures.
So your B value looks very flat.
Mhm.
Is that, do you understand why it doesn't care?
Yeah, I mean, I guess
That's your exponent, right?
yeah. Right, I guess, in this case, there is some small variation, right? But, as an exponent, the kind of the dynamic range is gonna be smaller.
Yeah.
I guess it might have made more sense if we had plotted that versus like log of B or something like that, see more variation. But I think that's the main reason.
Okay.
Right, and just kind of remember, this was the old picture, and here's the new picture where we have kind of the more clear structure that we found. Right, and so when we use that to kind of predict what happens, right, this is a surface plot where here this is basically error metric versus time, and then this dimension is the number of targets. So the lines are the data, and then the surface is our fit using this parametric model. Right, so we, I think do a pretty good job of capturing the trends in this. Right, so as the number of targets increases, right, we, kind of see this. Something is slightly wrong there.
It's really something reversed.
Yeah, I think we need to update that. But yeah, it should be, as the number of targets increases, you should do worse. I think something got weird there. So I'll need to correct that, but. Yeah, so anyways, like, do pretty well there. And then if we look at the structure of our dimensionless variable, this is kind of what we get, where we see the gamma 1 value, which again relates to this robot to target ratio, is a lot more important than gamma 2 or gamma 3. Right, so essentially the ratio of targets to robots seems to be the most important factor in how well the team is gonna do. Is the way to interpret this, and then those other ones do have some importance, but it's smaller. And then all these different lines are, right, we tried different search algorithms. And then we also tried an exponential model versus a sigmoid model for our measurement. And so I think the interesting thing here, right, is, all the different search algorithms and all the different, these two different families of models all have a pretty similar dimensionless variable structure, right? We're getting very similar exponents here. So I think this, at least to me, is kind of telling us that this is capturing something about how multi-robot, multi-target tracking operates in some way or another. Right, so it's, I think this is, that's stuff that is under review right now, so it's kind of hot off the press, or not even on the press yet, but this is, fun work that we just kind of wrapped up, that I think is pretty interesting. Right, so we've looked at, tracking, and then also using that to like evaluate team performance. Right, so I don't want to run too long, so maybe, I'll say, like, we've looked at other problems on like removing the assumption of perfect localization. Right, where we have, you have imperfect localization, then there's ambiguity in the boundary of the Voronoi cells. And we've also looked at kind of adapting cell sizes based on robots' abilities and workload, right? So if a robot's busy tracking something, it should be responsible for a smaller area. Or if a robot has a better sensor, it should be responsible for a bigger area, and trying to kind of adapt cell sizes to account for things like that. So we have some papers on that. I won't get into the details here. Right, so I guess the last little bit, I'll try to get through this in the next 5 minutes or so, is right, now that we know where things are in the world, how can we use that to move and do stuff? Right, so there's been a ton of work on robot navigation. There's things like dynamic window algorithm in the ROS navigation stack, social forces, potential functions, a bunch of things like that. All are great, but require hand tuning and don't work too well in very cluttered dynamic environments. Then there's a whole bunch of work on learning-based control. So can we use neural networks and machine learning to learn control policies? And it works reasonably well in static environments. Reinforcement learning, you have a sim to real gap, and it's hard to train. Right, so we're gonna again try to like bridge these things a little bit. We're using deep reinforcement learning, but we're trying to kind of apply some things that have worked well in these model-based approaches. Right, so we're trying to learn something that basically maps, sensor data and where we want the robot to go, to control actions, right? Forward velocity, steering velocity. Right, so we have convolutional neural network that we're using to actually generate the outputs. Right, but I think the more important part is what goes into the convolutional neural network. And that's where we're using this kind of target tracking stuff. So we have we're using computer vision and multi-object tracking to track people. We're then putting those people into a map that encodes both position and velocity, and then that is one input into our neural network. So, and then we also have LiDAR data, which just has static objects and people in it, and we're also putting those into another map that goes into our neural network. So we're kind of separating out everything, but then also highlighting people in particular. So we're feeding that information, from the multi-object tracking and just LiDAR data into our neural network. That's just gonna kind of skip that in the interest of time. Right, so then this is a gazebo replica of the lobby of the engineering building at a temple, right? We have some elevators over here. My lab is right here. It's a hallway to an adjacent building, some pillars, things like that. So we're using a pedestrian simulator based on the social force model to drive these 30 pedestrians to just move around the space. And we're using, deep reinforcement learning to train this neural network. Where, one of the most important things in reinforcement learning is your reward function. Right, so our reward function has 4 terms in it. Right, we have the basically reward, did you reach the goal, penalty for not reaching the goal. Yeah, this is a standard one. Another standard one is, penalize the robot if you hit something. Right, or penalize the robot a little bit if you get very close to something. Another reward signal that's commonly used is rotation rate. Right? So if the robot's changing directions really quick, right, that's not a good thing to do. So we just penalize fast rotations. And then the last one is the one that we added. Where here, what we want to do is, basically penalize deviation from a desired angle, where that desired angle comes from using velocity obstacles, right? So if you've heard of, reciprocal velocity obstacles or ORCA for, multi-robot navigation, right? Essentially, if you have perfect information about positions and velocities of all agents, you can guarantee safety of movement. So the velocity obstacle basically tells you, if I can go in this direction and I will not hit anything in the next X seconds. Right, so what we want to do is reward the robot for driving in that velocity obstacle direction, because we know it will be a safe direction for it to travel. So this is only penalizing collisions after they happen. This is rewarding the robot for avoiding collisions that might happen in the future. Right, and so we train, we have that reward. We train our robot in simulation, takes a week of processing. And then here's the robot driving around in our simulated world, using the policy that it learned. All right, so it's detecting all these people that are, floating around in this world. And the robot's just being told, drive to this location, and it's able to, not hit these simulated people. You can definitely tell it's a simulation when you see these like people kind of flipping sideways every now and then. But all right, so great. We trained it in simulation, it works in the environment we trained it in. That's good, but not great. So next what we did was we took the policy we learned in simulation. Or sorry, I guess first we, looked at, what happens, we trained at 30 pedestrians, what happens if I have 5 pedestrians or 55 pedestrians, different crowd sizes. We saw that, our approach, had a higher success rate, meaning fewer collisions, faster speeds than other baselines. And then we also tried ours, basically with that velocity obstacle reward versus without. And we saw particularly in big crowds that really helped increase success rate. We also tried it in different simulated environments. Again, we did better than the baselines in most of the environments. Again, happy to take questions on that a little bit. But the real, where the rubber meets the road is we took that policy in simulation and put it on a real robot in the lobby of the engineering building, where there's, actual people who don't just float around. And there's, visual texture to the space. Right, and, we just let it go. No retraining, nothing.
Does specularity of the floor matter?
I guess in this particular case, it seemed to be fine. Yeah, I mean, in general, that can lead to some like false positive detections and things like that, but we didn't find that it had too much trouble. So yeah, here again, we just gave the robot, waypoints saying go to that location, and it's just trying to drive through the space to get to where it's going. Right, and here a door opens, the robot turns away from the door as it's opening. It never saw a door open in simulation, but it still reacted appropriately, I think. Right, so, I think overall we were pleasantly surprised at how well it worked out of the box with no adjustments for simulation to reality. We also tried different environments. This is an outdoor space in between a couple of buildings. Right, so again, robot does does pretty well here. We also tried this in this was something called the barn competition. I forget what the acronym stood for, but essentially this was navigating through a highly cluttered but static environment, right? But same control policy, and actually a different robot here. This was a jackal as opposed to a turtle bot. Right, and again, like we didn't retrain it or anything. We just saw how it would work out of the box, and it did well in both simulation and hardware here. Right, so it works well both in dynamic scenes where we kind of trained it, but also in these cluttered static scenes as well.
What were the failure modes you saw that you didn't see in sim?
I think this was actually the harder one, where changing the robot model was a trick. We, essentially the robot learned based on its size, and now that we have a robot with a different size footprint, what we saw is there were a couple of environments where we would hit a box just because it would get too close to that box. So I think that's one of the things is like generalizing to different sensor mounting locations or different robot footprints is something we're like looking at now, but we don't have an answer for yet. But I think that was actually the biggest thing. Yeah.
Cool thing that it looks like it did is that when people hesitated in the videos, because you're using that velocity reward, it sees them slow down and it realizes there won't be a collision. So it goes when they hesitate, just like humans would.
Yeah.
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 Pretty neat.
Yeah, no, we were kind of pleasantly surprised at how well it actually worked in practice. I mean, also, in the real world, we saw a wider range of behavior, right? Some people are going to stop and stare, some people are going to move out of the way, some people are going to just ignore it. We didn't have anyone antagonize it, but that's probably because we were following it around the camera. Right, so that was so yes, we've been looking more at like collaborating with people in psychology to study like personal space and how we can account for that, and how personal space between person and person differs from person to robot personal space. And then also looking a little bit at kind of scene prediction. So how well can we predict what the environment is going to look like, a couple seconds from now, to again try to like be more proactive in our collision avoidance. Right, so kind of in summary here, right, we've used multi-object tracking as the basis for a lot of this work, and that's kind of how we built up a lot of the things in the lab, where we're looking at basically figuring out what is around the robot, how many things there are, where they're moving. Right, and we've used that for target tracking, navigation, and other things that I didn't have time to talk about here. Right, so I want to thank all the different students who contributed to parts of this project in different ways, current PhD students, alumni, undergrads, and different funding agencies. So, all right, happy to take any questions. Yeah.
Can you very briefly describe some of the directions you're going in for scene prediction? If that's all right.
Yeah, so one of the things we were thinking of is essentially you can think of an occupancy grid as an image, and as that changes over time, right, it's essentially a video prediction problem is one way you can think of it. So we were trying to look at kind of existing video prediction algorithms that are out there, and those are trying to be very general purpose, where it's like I'm trying to take any video on YouTube and predict the next 5 frames in that video. Right, whereas here we have a lot more structure to it, right? It's essentially a grayscale image where we have pretty sparse features in the image. And one of the downsides of a lot of video prediction is you get this kind of blurring, where if you see video prediction of people walking around, right, you'll see a person-ish thing, but it'll be blurry, right? And that blur is exactly what we want to avoid in navigation, right? Because we want to know if something is there. We don't want the person to just disappear from the frame. The person's not just going to suddenly disappear. So we were looking at kind of basically how can we build on some of the existing machine learning structures that are used in video prediction, but try to refine it to account for both how do we incorporate robot information, robot motion, right? Because this is, we want the map in the robot's local coordinate frame. And then also like try to keep these fine sparse structures in that. So we're using a variational autoencoder to, you know, basically and a recurrent neural network. Do that. Cool. Yeah. Yeah.
Thought about using your targeted identification to sell to people doing product, and, you know, advertising to make their products more, you know, noticeable. Because I think, you know, that water bottle example is crazy. Like, if I walked into a grocery store, like,
Yeah.
I would want to know, does my bottle stand out, you know, even if I have to stay within the blue, which I can imagine why they want blue, and, you
Yeah.
know, might be a really interesting kind of sidelight to what you're doing.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that at all, but no, that is interesting. Yeah, if you're trying to have like an impactful design, you want it to stand out and trying to figure out like some measure of like visual distinction. Yeah, that's a really interesting idea. I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah, I mean, when you mentioned talking to people in psychology or social psychology, I was like,
Yeah.
maybe advertise.
Yeah, we've been focusing more on the like human interaction in this just navigation idea, but yeah, I guess there's the a lot of cross collaboration opportunities. Yeah.
Same vein with like social psychology thing. But like when you were talking about personal space, I don't know, like this may be niche, but like I played a Rockstar game like 15-20 years ago or something where the characters could not be run over by your car. And like that's something where like within a certain proximity they would move. Then obviously like it was an E10 game, you could do that. There had to be some heuristic where the person was like programmed to move. And is that something that like could be easily transferred to what you're doing? To say that like this simulated human would, you know, go on its path until there's a certain proximity of the robot and it's gonna veer out of its way. You avoid collision.
Yeah, I mean, I think that could be possible. I think one of the things we're finding that's the hardest in that is that like social behaviors are very dependent on the context. Right, like, you know, if you're in a, you know, crowded train, right, you're fine with someone being right up against you. But if you're in a conference room like this, it's a little bit more weird to have someone like right, you know, bumping into your shoulder. Right, and it also depends, you know, so both on like environmental features, like just density of crowd in this kind of space, but then also things like, you know, retail versus office versus household, you know, like all these different kind of social spaces that have their own rules and their own contexts just makes it hard to kind of figure out like, all right, like I know that, you know, there's these personal space bubbles, but like the size and shape of that kind of depends on context and how can we like measure that and encode that in a way that the robot can understand. And like that's a question we're still struggling with right now. But yeah, I mean, I think I don't see any reason why like you couldn't encode that, right? But you know, once you start encoding individual rules, right, there's just so many social rules that are out there, it just becomes this like game of like, all right, like, you know, kind of whack-a-mole, right? You hit one and then three more pop up. It's going to be hard to like build rules around all of them, and then again figure out like which ones do I prioritize and when. Yeah, it's hard, but fun.
All right,
Yeah.
let's thank our speaker.
Thanks.